At 4:30 a.m. on July 12, 1943, Lieutenant Alexander Fadin crouched inside his T-34 tank in a sunflower field 6 kilometers south of Prokhorovka. He watched 200 German Tiger and Panther tanks advance through the pre-dawn darkness. The ground shook. Diesel smoke filled the air along with the loud screech of tank tracks. Fadin could see every detail of the German armor through his periscope, including the long-barreled 88mm guns, the thick frontal armor, and the confident formation of veterans who had defeated Soviet armor across 2,000 kilometers of the Eastern Front. 3 weeks earlier, German forces had launched Operation Citadel, the largest armored offensive in history. They sent 780,000 men and 2,928 tanks against Soviet defenses at Kursk. Soviet losses in the first 72 hours were devastating, with 1,614 tanks destroyed and 24,000 men killed. German Tiger tanks were almost invulnerable since their armor was too thick for standard Soviet anti-tank guns. Their 88mm cannons could destroy T-34s from 2,000 meters, 4 times the effective range of Soviet 76mm guns. Every tactical analysis favored the Germans. They had better tanks, better optics, better training, and better tactics. German tank crews were veterans with 18 months of combat experience. They knew how to maneuver, use the terrain, and kill Soviet armor before the Soviet guns could even aim back. Yet by the end of July 1943, Soviet tank crews would have higher survival rates than any other armored force in World War II. This was not because Soviet tanks were better. They weren't, and not because Soviet tactics were superior. They weren't at first. The reason was that the Soviet military had created the most effective tank crew survival system ever, based on harsh lessons learned over 10,000 kilometers of retreat and 23 months of the bloodiest combat in history. The question wasn't whether Soviet tank crews were brave. Everyone knew they were. The real question was how they managed to survive when German tanks clearly outmatched them in almost every category. The answer begins not at Prokhorovka in July 1943, but in the wheat fields of Ukraine in June 1941. On June 22, 1941, at 3:15 a.m., 3.8 million German soldiers crossed the Soviet border in Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in military history. The Wehrmacht brought 3,350 tanks. The Red Army had 22,600 tanks, including the renowned T-34 and KV-1, which were so much better than German armor that Wehrmacht officers initially refused to believe the reports. Within 6 weeks, the Red Army lost 11,712 tanks. This was not due to superior German armor. The Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks making up most of the German forces were less capable than the Soviet T-34s in armor, firepower, and mobility. Soviet tanks were being destroyed because their tactics were deeply flawed, and their crews lacked the knowledge to survive in mechanized combat. The issues were widespread and fatal. Soviet tanks operated in large groups of 500 to 600 vehicles without any coordinated tactics. Tank commanders received vague orders such as attack to the west, with no clear goals, no scouting, no artillery support, and no air cover. Soviet tanks advanced in straight lines across open terrain, easily visible from 5 kilometers away, making them perfect targets for German anti-tank guns. Soviet tank crews had no radios. Command tanks had receivers only, allowing them to listen but not respond. Regular tanks had no communication equipment at all. This made coordination impossible. If the lead tank was destroyed, the following tanks simply stopped, unable to figure out what to do next. German forces took out Soviet tank groups by destroying the command tank first, then systematically eliminating the immobilized survivors. Soviet ammunition was stored in racks inside the crew compartment, with no protection. A single penetrating hit could ignite the ammunition, causing an internal explosion that killed the entire crew instantly. German tankers referred to Soviet tanks as flaming coffins. One hit meant they caught fire. The crew had seconds to escape before the ammunition exploded. Most did not survive. Training for Soviet tank crews was minimal. Drivers received only 5 hours of training. Gunners practiced at stationary ranges against fixed targets. Commanders studied tactics from manuals written in 1935 about fighting Polish cavalry. No one trained for combat against German mechanized forces because Soviet doctrine assumed the Red Army would fight the war on enemy soil, not in Soviet territory. The losses were unprecedented.
By December 1941, the Red Army had lost 20,500 tanks, more than the entire Wehrmacht owned. Soviet tank crew casualties exceeded 300,000 men who were either killed or captured. Entire tank corps simply vanished. The 4th Mechanized Corps lost 313 tanks in 4 days. The 15th Mechanized Corps was wiped out in 3 days. The 8th Mechanized Corps lasted 5 days before being completely destroyed. The disaster of 1941 forced the Soviet military to face a harsh truth. Courage alone was not enough. Soviet tank crews were ready to die, proving it daily. However, willingness to die did not mean they could fight effectively before dying. The Red Army needed tank crews who could last long enough to actually destroy German tanks. What followed was a significant military change aimed specifically at crew survival in modern warfare. On January 8, 1942, Marshal Georgy Zhukov stood in a frozen headquarters 40 kilometers east of Moscow and issued an order that would change Soviet armored warfare. Tank crews who abandon damaged vehicles without orders will face court-martial. Tank crews who save their vehicles and return them to service will receive immediate promotion and awards. The order seemed contradictory. How could crews save damaged vehicles if staying with them meant death? The answer was that Zhukov wasn't telling tank crews to die with their tanks. He wanted the Red Army to create systems that allowed crews to save salvageable tanks and survive the process. This distinction was critical. It shifted the focus from tank performance to crew survival. In just 3 months, the Soviet military made changes that took other armies years to develop. Every Soviet tank crew began training specifically for emergency escape. This wasn't just theory. It involved practical, repetitive, timed drills until escape became automatic. Crews practiced escaping from tanks in total darkness. They practiced escaping from overturned tanks. They practiced using different hatches when primary hatches were blocked. They practiced escaping from tanks filling with water. They practiced escaping from burning tanks. The standard was strict. Every crew member had to escape a simulated burning tank in under 8 seconds. Commanders would go first to open the hatches. Drivers and gunners would follow in order. Loaders went last. It took 8 seconds from the bailout command to having the entire crew outside the tank.
German tank crews trained for combat. Soviet tank crews trained for survival first and combat second. The reasoning was clear. A crew that survives a destroyed tank can man another tank. A dead crew cannot. Soviet engineers redesigned ammunition storage in every tank model in production. Ammunition racks were moved from the crew compartment to spots below the turret ring or in hull sponsons, separated from the crew by armor plates. This change reduced internal space and cut down ammunition capacity, but it greatly improved crew survival rates. A penetrating hit might still set off ammunition, but the explosion would vent through hull plates rather than into the crew compartment. Crews had 15 to 30 seconds to escape before secondary explosions happened, which was enough time if they had trained properly. And they had trained. The modification was applied across 12,000 T-34 tanks in 4 months. Soviet factories didn't wait for perfect solutions. They implemented good enough solutions right away and refined them in later production runs. The Red Army introduced a crew rotation system that was new to armored warfare. Tank crews who survived 3 combat missions were rotated to training units for 2 weeks. This wasn't punishment, but a chance to teach. Surviving crews instructed new crews on what had helped them stay alive, which terrain offered cover, which German tactics to watch for, how to spot anti-tank gun positions, where to position tanks for mutual support, how to escape burning tanks, how to navigate minefields, and how to coordinate with infantry. This created a rapid transfer of knowledge. Lessons learned in combat on Monday were taught to new crews by Friday. Innovations developed by individual crews spread throughout entire tank units within weeks. No other military had this setup. German tank crews remained with their units until they were killed or wounded. There was no systematic transfer of knowledge. British tank crews rotated to rest areas but not to training duties. American tank crews didn't face intense armored combat until 1944.
Soviet tank crews who survived became teachers who helped create more survivors. The survival rate increased significantly. The Red Army created the most effective battlefield recovery system of any military. Tank recovery units operated directly behind combat formations, evacuating damaged tanks within hours of engagement. The metric was simple: 60% of damaged Soviet tanks were back in service within 72 hours. This wasn't due to Soviet tanks being easier to repair. Rather, the Red Army focused on fast recovery and placed repair units at the tactical level instead of the operational level. German damaged tanks were sent to rear area workshops for repair and reassignment to new units. In contrast, Soviet damaged tanks were fixed on-site and returned to their original crews. This allowed experienced crews to continue fighting in familiar vehicles, maintaining crew cohesion and ensuring survival knowledge stayed with operational units. If you want to see how these systems changed Soviet armored effectiveness from catastrophic defeat to tactical advantage, please hit that like button. It helps us share more untold stories like this, and subscribe if you haven't already. Now, back to the transformation. Soviet tank tactics shifted completely based on survival data. The Red Army moved away from large tank formations and adopted small, flexible combat groups of 3 to 5 tanks working together. Forward tanks engaged German armor to draw fire. Flanking tanks maneuvered to attack from the side, where German armor was weakest. Support tanks provided covering fire during maneuvers. If one tank was hit, others covered its withdrawal or helped the crew escape. The doctrine prioritized tank survival over enemy kills. A Soviet tank that survived to fight another day was more valuable than a tank that destroyed 2 German tanks but was lost in the process. This was revolutionary thinking. Other militaries measured success by enemy tanks destroyed. The Red Army measured success by friendly tanks recovered. German commanders took note of this change. Intelligence reports from summer 1942 showed that Soviet tank formations had become significantly more cautious and coordinated compared to 1941. German tank crews observed that Soviet tanks now withdrew before being destroyed instead of fighting to immobility. This appeared to be cowardice to German officers, but in reality it reflected intelligent survival tactics.
By July 1943, when Fedin's tank reached Prokhorovka, the change was complete. Soviet tank crews still faced German armor that was technically superior. Tiger and Panther tanks still outgunned T-34s. German optical sights were still better and their commanders had more experience. But now, Soviet tank crews had something more crucial: a system designed to keep them alive long enough to offset German advantages. At Prokhorovka, the largest tank battle ever, 850 Soviet tanks faced 600 German tanks over 30 square kilometers of rolling terrain. German tanks should have dominated. Their guns could destroy Soviet tanks from distances where Soviet guns couldn't fire back. The Soviet strategy was different. T-34 crews charged ahead at full speed, closing the gap before German long-range advantages mattered. They moved in coordinated groups with flank attacks. When German tanks took out frontline Soviet tanks, supporting tanks helped their crews escape and pressed the attack. The battle lasted 8 hours. Soviet losses were steep, with 235 tanks destroyed. However, 174 of these tanks were recovered within 48 hours and returned to service. German losses totaled 75 tanks destroyed, but only 14 were recovered because their recovery units operated from the rear, not forward. More importantly, Soviet tank crew casualties were 1,843 men killed or wounded out of about 4,250 crew members engaged, resulting in a casualty rate of 43%. German tank crew casualties were 720 men killed or wounded out of around 3,000 engaged, leading to a 24% casualty rate. The raw casualty rates favored Germany, but the recovery rates revealed another story. 68% of Soviet tank crews who abandoned damaged vehicles survived. Only 34% of German crews who left damaged vehicles survived, mainly because Soviet infantry killed German crews trying to escape. Soviet crews survived because they trained for it. They knew how to escape. They understood where friendly forces were positioned. They knew recovery units would pick them up within hours. They fought differently because they believed survival was possible. Between July 1943 and May 1945, Soviet tank crew survival rates consistently exceeded those of German, British, or American tank crews when measured per engagement rather than per casualty.
The data was clear. Soviet tank crew members who survived their first 3 combat encounters had a 71% chance of surviving the next 10. German tank crew members who survived their first 3 encounters had a 52% chance of survival for the next 10. British tank crew survival rates were 61% for the same period, while American rates were 64%. The Soviet advantage was not dramatic, it was systematic. Soviet tank crews survived a little better with each engagement. Over time, these small improvements added up. By 1944, the average Soviet tank crew had 8 months of combat experience. The average German crew had 11 months. But the average Soviet crew had operated 3.2 different tanks. In contrast, the average German crew had worked with 1.8 tanks. Soviet crews continued fighting after losing multiple vehicles. German crews tended to be killed or wounded alongside their original tanks. The Red Army maintained 12,000 operational tanks from mid-1943 until the war's end. German tank strength never topped 5,000 operational tanks after July 1943. Part of that difference came from production capacity, but part was about crew survival. Soviet tank crews not only recovered damaged tanks, but also crewed replacements and kept fighting. German tank crews either died with their vehicles or were captured because their recovery systems couldn't reach them. The Soviet tank crew survival advantage stemmed from 5 connected factors. First, the Red Army recognized that crew survival mattered more than tank performance. Other militaries focused on building better tanks. The Soviets developed better survival systems for average tanks, which was practical. Soviet industry could produce 1,000 T-34s a month, but couldn't make 1,000 Tigers monthly. So the Red Army prioritized crew survival in mass-produced tanks rather than crew protection in limited production supertanks. Second, the Red Army placed recovery and repair resources at the tactical level. Other militaries positioned these resources at the operational or strategic level. This setup meant Soviet crews knew help would arrive within hours, not days. That understanding influenced their combat approach. Crews fought more aggressively when they believed damaged tanks would be retrieved and fixed. Third, the Red Army organized knowledge sharing from experienced crews to new ones. The rotation system helped spread survival tactics throughout the force. Individual innovations quickly became standard practices. Other militaries depended on formal training, which took months to refresh. Fourth, the Red Army defined success by crew survival, not enemy kills. This created different incentives. Soviet commanders who kept their crews safe while completing missions received promotions. Those who destroyed enemy tanks but lost their entire crews did not receive the same rewards. Other militaries promoted leaders based on the number of enemy tanks destroyed, which fostered aggressive tactics that endangered experienced crews. Fifth, the Red Army focused training on survival, not just combat skills. Emergency escape training, ammunition handling procedures, recovery coordination, and casualty evacuation were all mandatory, equal in importance to gunnery and driving. Other militaries viewed survival as an individual's responsibility rather than an organizational priority. These factors came together to create a survival system that compensated for tactical and technical weaknesses. Soviet tanks were generally less capable than German tanks throughout the war. Soviet optics were poorer, Soviet radios were less dependable, Soviet doctrine was simpler. However, Soviet crews survived longer, leading to faster experience accumulation and greater effectiveness over time. The contradiction was that Soviet technological disadvantages spurred the growth of better survival systems. German tank superiority led to complacency regarding crew survival. German commanders believed that superior tanks ensured crew safety, but they were mistaken. Tank quality and crew survival were not the same thing. Lieutenant Alexander Fadin survived Prokhorovka. His tank was destroyed on the 3rd day of battle. He and his crew escaped in 6 seconds. Recovery units evacuated them in 2 hours. They were crews in a replacement T-34 within 48 hours. Fadin survived 11 more tank losses by the end of the war, operating 13 different vehicles. He trained 47 new tank crews in survival procedures. He earned the Hero of the Soviet Union Award in January 1945, not for destroying enemy tanks, but for saving crew members.
Stories like Fadin's were common in Soviet tank armies by 1944. Crews experienced multiple vehicle losses. More experienced crews stayed in combat longer. They gained knowledge. Survival rates improved. The Red Army kept its combat strength despite ongoing losses because its systems prioritized keeping experienced personnel in the fight. Other militaries studied the Soviet model but found it hard to replicate. They needed to prioritize crew survival over tank performance, position recovery assets forward, streamline knowledge transfer, measure success by preserving crews rather than destroying the enemy, and train specifically for survival. These changes needed a transformation at an institutional level. Most militaries couldn't make those adjustments quickly enough. The Soviet military succeeded because survival was essential. It made the difference between collapsing and winning. The Red Army that fought at Kursk in July 1943 was not the same as the one that was destroyed in June 1941. The transformation did not focus on better tanks or doctrine. It centered on better systems for keeping tank crews alive long enough to learn how to fight effectively. That was the real achievement, not tactical brilliance or technological superiority. It was a strong commitment to crew survival as the foundation of effective armored warfare. The Soviet approach showed that in armored combat, crew survival was the critical factor. Armies with superior tanks but weaker survival systems lost experienced crews. In contrast, armies with weaker tanks but stronger survival systems kept their experienced crews. Over time, experience counted more than technology. This lesson remains important today. Modern militaries still deal with the same choice: technical superiority or crew preservation. The Soviet experience from 1941 to 1945 proved that focusing on crew survival leads to long-term military effectiveness more consistently than short-term technical advantages. In May 1945, Lieutenant Fadin stood in a field near Berlin, watching his 13th tank crew celebrate victory. They had destroyed 12 tanks while keeping 13 crews intact and training 47 crews. Countless enemy positions were taken out. But Fadin's true achievement wasn't the destruction he caused, it was the survival he enabled. Soviet tank crews survived longer than any other armored force in World War II because the Red Army created systems that supported survival. Not guaranteed, not easy, but possible. In the harsh reality of armored warfare, the chance of survival was enough. If this story moved you as it moved us, do me a favor and hit that like button. Every like tells YouTube to share this story with more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We rescue forgotten stories from old archives every single day. These are stories about forces that proved themselves through adaptability and systematic innovation. Real history, real lessons, real transformation. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you are watching from. Are you in the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, or Australia? Our community spans the globe. You're not just a viewer, you help keep these memories alive. Share your location. If someone in your family served in armored forces, let us know. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for ensuring these lessons don't fade into silence. These transformations deserve to be remembered, and you are helping to make that happen.